Oh, hi, I'm the True Wise Gamer, giving off my vast knowledge so you may understand games a bit better. So last time I did Final Fantasy V. Now it is time to actually do, well, the request I was actually originally given. Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light. I originally called it 4 Warriors of Light for some reason. I don't know why. It sounds better that way because of, like, the series, but, at another time. Ironically, because I played Final Fantasy V, it more cemented my feelings on that game as a whole, which is actually good in the long run. But let's actually talk about Final Fantasy for a moment. Final Fantasy, as I mentioned before, I have played at least most of the mainline games. But the spin-offs is a whole other matter. Like, to put this in a way you can understand, I'm pretty sure there are more spin-offs of Final Fantasy than there are mainline Final Fantasy games. And not to count, like, the side sequels, I mean just the mainline base number, like Final Fantasy 12. Like, there is a sequel to Final Fantasy 12 that no one ever talks about. And it's canonical. It's weird, but you get the idea.
So who made this game? Well, it was done by Matrix Software, which I'm actually very familiar with, due to having played a lot of their games, so a quick rundown of who they are. It was a company made after Climax Entertainment collapsed. Don't worry, they're not important. Where the developers of that company actually decided to join up to make Matrix Software, and focus on RPGs for the most part. Some of their most notable work is with Square with the Final Fantasy 3 and 4 3D remake, which are some of the better experiences than the Pixel remaster. I only say that for 4 because, well, it also had voice acting, which actually does add to the quality of the game, plus some of the reworks Final Fantasy 3 had, but that's a whole other discussion. They also worked on the Dragon Quest V 3D version and Tower Duraga 3D, which are actually pretty good. I actually own a sealed semi-copy of Tower Duraga. It's complicated, maybe whenever I talk about it. Plus a bunch of other games that I could mention, but those can be another time. They also made, however, the Final Fantasy IV After Years, and the mobile ports of Final Fantasy V and VI, which are just... But you get the idea. While some questionable stuff was made by them, they're otherwise great developers. Plus, with the help of Takashi Tokita and Tomoya Asano, who are actually very important, let's get into them now. The former Takashi Tokita, who, if you don't remember, directed Chrono Trigger, Live Alive, and Parasite Eve. With Tomoya Asano being a producer who produced a few games that I have actually covered before, one of those being the FMA games, and would later produce a lot of the so-called HD pixel games, which are mostly all good, but those can be handled another time, because they're really good and I really want to cover them someday. Plus also, well, Bravely Default, which was actually going to be a sequel to this game, but was later decided to change it since, while they're not radically that different, there was enough elements to make it its own thing, which in all honesty was for the best.
Now, 4 Heroes of Light was always marketed as a game that was done in the old style of RPGs with modern technology, which, in concept, is not a bad thing, but as we will continue on and talk about the game as a whole, you'll see that idea kind of crumbles down really quick. But I'm going on a little too much, so let's actually begin the review for Final Fantasy IV Heroes of Light.
So our story begins like a lot of RPGs with our main protagonist, Brant, waking up as in the town of Horn. When a child becomes 14, they must go to the king to become a man. When he goes to meet the king's second daughter has been kidnapped by the nearby witch. However, the king has already sent a squadron there, but they haven't returned yet. So he decides to send you in order to do something, with also sending in Jesqua. I'm not sure that's how to pronounce his name, but In any case, he's a very laid-back guy, do-nothing attitude, which causes him to be a jerk, which he will grow out of. While at the witch's lair, we also meet Unita, the Knight of Horn, who is also the bodyguard of the Princess Heir. Yes, that is her name, and I'm not entirely sure that's how you pronounce her name either. I'm not sure about how their names are pronounced anyway, so sorry about that. And the princess is the typical spoiled princess, but still has some goodness in them that needs to be, drawn out. After defeating the witch, we soon meet with the crystal, who says it's our job to save the world and gives us this game's version of the job system, that being the crown system, but more on this because... ugh. However, before we actually defeated the witch, she mentions a contract as she leaves, and suddenly the town of Horn is now turned to stone, with the king missing. And after this point, the game has an interesting idea, but it's not done well. Instead of the group staying together as a group, they decide to separate for a time, and it takes about halfway through the game before they, well, reconverge.
This actually causes a lot of issues, so for now, I think it's a good idea if we talk about the gameplay as a whole, since it causes a lot of issues for better and for worse.
In this game, gameplay is a little weird. In battle, everything is tied to the APP system, where everyone has up to 5 ability points, and can store them for later. You get one every turn, which you can choose to attack, store up a point for later, or use abilities based on the crowns you have on, which causes a lot of issues since certain basic things are tied to crowns. For example, running away from battle. Yeah, it's tied to a certain crown, meaning if you don't have it, you will just have to fight battles, which is weird because that just means it's a job that can only ever run away from battle and it's only ever useful for gem grinding, which let's get into that now. Gems are the most important thing in this game. Without them, you don't get a lot. Let's elaborate on that. Crowns only have one ability available, if even that, and you have to put gems on them to increase their abilities. Neat idea, but you don't gain gil in battle. So you have to sell gems to gain gil, which in concept is not bad. It's a good idea for a risk versus reward system. So what's the problem? It's essentially not a risk anymore after a moment in the game where you can gain infinite gil because of a game design that basically made it so that players could sell items for more than they're actually worth and make super bank, which made it so that barely after an hour of doing it, I never needed to worry about money ever again, which also caused another issue, but more on that later in a bit. That meant I could actually keep my gems for the crowns. However, I noticed another issue. See, certain jobs are just better than others. They outclass everything to such a degree that not using them would be weird unless you're going for some anti-meta strategy. See, in my Final Fantasy V review, I mentioned the amount of freedom you have, and what you can do. There was never really one job that was outright better than all the others. Sure, there were differences between the jobs, some were just better than certain other jobs, but they were all at least equal, due to the utilities of all the other jobs, because you could take one ability from one job and give it to the other job and make it so much better. But because of the crown system, it means that jobs only have value to themselves, meaning they cannot grow stronger through the other jobs or through battle. Yeah, the only way crowns can grow stronger is through gems, meaning if you don't have a certain amount of them, it means they are stuck there forever until you can find enough, and it's only for that one character, meaning it limits character variety since that player won't change to different crowns since they already put so much into one job. Why switch now? And one could argue that Final Fantasy V has this issue too, where players will just stick to one job. Well, I mean, sure, but it's the difference between making the job good on its own terms, rather than putting in something into it to make it actually more functionable. Plus, even besides that, when the teams are separated, why would you change their forms all that much because it works well now? And I know for a fact it will be unable to stop me. Plus also the amount of jobs is lacking unless you explore the game, which, to be frank, is not a bad way to hiding jobs. But for the most part, you really don't need them. And I really mean you don't need them. In fact, to sidetrack for a moment, I like to stop and talk about job system games as a whole for a moment and elaborate on them since it feels like this game doesn't understand the importance of job-based systems. And before we talk about that, we also need to talk about party-based RPGs, or games with team members who have primary classes, or something they are particularly good at. Like, for example, Final Fantasy X, where the enemies are particular and have certain ways of being defeated, meaning that your allies can be more structured in such a way to handle those particular foes more easily. Plus, because the game knows what you have available, it could challenge you in different ways, like taking a team member away, or cooperation of two classes working together, so on and so forth. Now, job-based RPGs are more focused on what you can do and challenge you in ways on, is your team capable of handling most fights? Throwing against certain foes who, while your team might be able to handle easily, the next set of enemies might be something you're entirely unable to handle, due to the choices you made along the way. Now, of course, this rule isn't 100% as some systems can mix and match certain aspects. However, that is the primary way they are different. And I mention this because For Warriors of Light seems to not understand what makes a job-based game fun. Experimentation with the jobs you have. Which is really weird because they both worked on Final Fantasy 3 and 4, so they must have some idea of how it functions. Because in this game, they might as well just be main jobs with sub-jobs they might switch into, but will always revert back to their main role. And heck, with how this game is designed, sticking with certain jobs are literally just the best because they are the strongest. Now, what are those broken jobs? Those jobs being the black and white mage. Why? Because their abilities of making magic, for the most part, free to use. Meaning there is no need to worry about using them ever in battle. Because for the most part, magic usually has a higher cost to it, just so that you don't keep constantly spamming it. But because the black and white mage had the ability to reduce its cost, it's practically free. This is also added with the element system, which becomes a major factor of the game. And speaking of elements, there's also the elementalist, who takes half damage from the element, and can give that benefits to the party. Which, because enemies do use elemental attacks sometimes, if you equip elemental shields to them, depending on the area, you'll practically take no damage and can easily wipe most bosses because they focus on one element for the most part, and even then, because of again the elementalist's ability to make the party more resistant to them, it means battles become more trivial and just makes them a tiring thing you have to do. But okay, but what's the last one? Because there must be one more. Well, there is, I just didn't use it for this playthrough, but let me tell you, it's more busted than I realized. So, okay, there's the merchant class. Essentially, it helps you try to gain more gems. But later on, it gains abilities like, hey, I'm gonna pay money so I don't take damage. But its last ability is super powerful. That last ability allows them to pay 1,000 gil to deal 1% of however much money you have. Which, if you didn't remember earlier, you will likely have a lot of gil. Meaning this move is super busted. And with that combo, nothing can really stop you, well, except one boss, but even then it was more of a war of attrition thing, due to again being so powerfully busted. The game kinda just stops being an issue for the longest time. Heck, when the game begins level scaling, which is a thing that is never explained, it's just something here, it doesn't really add to the game's challenge as a whole. And to be sort of fair to the game, it's at least done well enough better than Final Fantasy VIII where it becomes very, very hard very quickly due to how the enemies are scaled in that game. But we can handle that another time. And I'm still surprised the game never mentions it, that it's doing that. Heck, there are actually a few more mechanics that are just not explained. For example, crowns have stats. And I'm not just talking about these stats, I'm talking about these stats. It basically says, hey, this weapon I'm using can be more effective than this other weapon I'm having on. Which I have no idea why it doesn't tell us that. Another thing the game doesn't tell us about is how it actually targets things. What am I talking about? You see, in the game, you don't actually get the choice on who you're targeting. The game will auto-target for you for some reason. However, it has certain rules to it that just aren't explained. Like, melee attacks will always hit the front, while magical and range attacks will always hit the back. but melee attacks will also only ever hit the left first. Magic and range attacks will always hit the left side first. And while it doesn't matter, I just think it's weird that that thing is hidden. Like the next thing that's hidden, and is actually the reason why I never changed crowns. You see, I mentioned earlier that battle doesn't make the job better. You see, that's a lie. Sort of. See, every 50 battles adds to a crown's level. It gets better in damage and healing. That is it. It doesn't increase anything else, but it fundamentally made me just say, why would I change my jobs if the jobs I have are pretty good at doing those two particular things? Like, why would I worry about my armor that much when I can just insta-kill most foes on a whim? Which, speaking of, I didn't mention this earlier because why the heck should I? You can actually upgrade your armor, so yeah, you can actually get buffer. And I actually only ever did this at the end of the game when the final boss was dealing so much damage that I couldn't win. But after I got upgraded, it was just another easy win. The game cannot fundamentally challenge you, which I'm not holding against the game. But at the same time, if you're going to create a system, it has to be engaging, or give incentives to engage with the system.
And this is where... I don't know why I said that. And there really is nothing more to talk about, other than the plot and how it fundamentally doesn't work all that well. Like, it works sometimes, but on a fundamental level, it just...
So what is wrong with the plot? Well, not much, but that's mostly because it's hardly there. It kinda has the Final Fantasy III problem, and I'm talking about the remake, but not entirely, as it seems to not understand the problem it has, I think. The problem I noticed in a lot of reviews is that they mention that the characters are very flat, and I really can't disagree since there's not a lot of moments with them, so when my mind tries to think of them, they're drawing blanks because there's just not enough there. Jesqua and Air have an arc, but it's so standard and lackluster. By that I mean it lacks power or much else to it. It plays it as intended. Like, to explain what I'm talking about, to give an example, in Tales of Abyss, the main character has a similar arc to Air, but because of the amount of time with that character, you probably understand and care more about that character because you see more of that character's personality throughout the entire game. However, Air is just the archetype. Mind you, archetypes are fine, it's just that, you know, there needs to be more to them than the archetype. Or at least things around them that makes them seem more there. And the thing is, the game could have done more with the characters. It has enough time, it just doesn't want to do anything with it. Quick lesson, or at least some advice if you're ever making an RPG. The longer the RPG is, the more it needs to be developed everything. Cause gameplay can be only so interesting for so long before you want either an end or it to mean something. In a narrative sense, to be clear. You then might be wondering, hey, I referenced Final Fantasy III. Why am I mentioning that? Well, you see, Final Fantasy III Remake made an actual change for the better. You see, in the original game, the kids didn't actually have personalities or were different from each other. The remake actually gave them characters and a sort of backstory, and it sort of worked, kinda, sorta, not entirely. While they had a personality, they just lacked moments to shine as individual characters for the most part. I mean, like, they had minor ways of showing it. For example, when the characters actually become friends with the characters of the story arc they're in at the moment. Like the Warring Kingdoms kid becoming friends with the Shy One. And if you're wondering why I don't remember their names, don't ask me, I forget their names constantly. The only one anyone remembers is this one. It's a neat use of their character, but at the same time, they don't really develop them in any meaningful way.
And to be clear, I am talking about developing them as characters, not changing them. Which wouldn't really fix the problem because I don't care about them at all. Because why would I care about them changing if I didn't like them to begin with? Which is an important thing to remember. Because a lot of people make the mistake that developing a character means you're changing the character.
And it only annoys me because the game aesthetic is great. Like, the idea of the game being a storybook-esque game, and it just delivers that wholesale. The artist for the game is amazing. I've always loved their work, and it didn't disappoint here. And I'm glad that the developers were able to capture its look very well without losing anything about it. And while the music is not my particular cup of tea, it's not bad at all and has a good tune here or there. And again, that storybook idea can work really well, but the problem is, well again, the gameplay is too easy and too numerous, meaning for a good chunk of it, you're doing nothing. And when it gets back to the plot, it's bare bones. Which, speaking of, one of the characters that really confused me was Unita. Yeah, her. She has a character which just confuses me because her description and character are two separate things. Her bio says she's a stoic character but is worried about if she's doing her job right. But the game never brings that up, or even is a thing about her. She seems to show a lot of emotions most times than not. And it's not helped that we're taken away from her on multiple occasions just because. Seriously, two of the characters just abandoned her for no explainable reason. They just leave her. And they reference the idea that she would have been a problem, which... what? Where's this coming from? And Brandit? I don't even think he has a character. I mean, like, the end of the game has this weird thing about some other character that I can't remember right now because it didn't really matter. And it's at the end of the freaking game. Like, how dare you try to do this shit right at the end? How dare you? And it just becomes this thing about where I just don't care what's going on or why it should matter. It doesn't really help that the game actually has some interesting ideas for plots. It just could have been better if the characters did more. It just felt like it was going through the motions rather than doing anything meaningful. And that's not even to say it was bad. It was just bland. And with that just not caring, it just prevented me from being okay with the game as a whole. Unlike FF5's plot, where the game has many moments with the characters being silly or doing things to emphasize their character, which is there to make sure they're just not one note. I honestly have not much to say than the final boss was there, I guess. Like, he has a cool look to him and a cool concept behind him that is well enough executed, but at the same time, it's just there. In fact, speaking of the villains, it feels like if the game had the stories all tied together into one section, it would have been fine. So, let me elaborate. The first section actually has the characters all be separated. This is where you learn the initial story. Then, the second section is where everyone's together, and now they're gone back in time or in a different world. I'm not sure, they don't really explain it well. And your job is to go back and just stop the bad thing from happening. Which is just there, I guess. And honestly, because they're so short, I honestly believe that if they had just found a way to just kind of bring them together into one narrative, or basically just make it like we learn the actual truth of the situation and handle that, would have been just overall better. And heck, maybe try to emphasize more of this aspect of the game that just never comes up, but is in the promotion. You see, in one of the trailers for this game, the developer, I think it was Tomoyaki or somebody else, I don't know, we'll have it on screen. But in any case, he basically talks about how the towns also represent the 7 deadly sins. But I have no idea how the heck that even works. But whatever. It's there, I guess, and I just have to shrug.
At the end of the day, as a whole, the game is just bland. It's not interesting enough on a purely gameplay term to hold me. The story is basically just so basic to the point of being bad at some level because it's so one-noted. The characters are lackluster and aren't interesting at all, and the only thing that made it worthwhile to do anything was the aesthetics, which I again have to really do praise, and maybe the music, but again that's a purely me thing. But it just doesn't really all gel together that well. However, next time we're doing a little something different. Next time we're covering Armored Core 4 and the start of Miyazaki's rise to fame. See you next time.